students have never been asked, what would you say is the difference between studying and learning? And typically they'll say things like, studying is just memorizing information for a test or a quiz, whereas learning is when you understand that information, you can apply it, you can relate it to what you already know. But nobody's ever gone over this because we've always told them in school, did you study for that test? See, the goal is to help students understand what is the difference between what I've done up to this point and what I need to do going forward to get a different result.
Have you ever talked to students about study skills? Did they lean in with unbridled enthusiasm, or did your intuition suggest this might not be the right approach? Dr. Saundra McGuire, author, educator, and expert on student learning, has some helpful guidance for us. Together we tackle the metacognitive equity gap, the unseen divide between students who have been taught how to think about their learning and those who haven't, and why talking about metacognition, not just study tips, could be the shift we need to get students to trade memorization for real learning. Welcome to Higher Listenings.
Well, your passion is quite evident. All the times that we've engaged, it's really clear. It's not surprising you have won awards for mentorship here. Metacognition is a particular area of specialty, really. You're an expert, acknowledged expert in the importance of that in particular. Was that driven by a particular encounter? Did that surface in your experience early in a way that you're like, this is something I've got to really direct my attention to?
I actually heard that word the first time when I was at Cornell. I was the associate director of the Learning Center, and we had a fantastic learning strategist, Helene Selko. And one day around the copy machine, I heard her students, they were talking about metacognition. There was all this buzz. Didn't know what the term meant, did not think I needed to know what it meant. But then fast forward about 20 years later, when I am the new director of the Learning Center at LSU, and I am looking for a way to get students' attention, because I know if we talk about study skills, most students' eyes glaze over. They don't want to hear about study skills. And so then, but I came across metacognition again, remembering, oh yeah, I'd heard this term. And those students were really excited about it. And so I started thinking that if I used metacognition as the construct to teach students exactly how they could be in control of their thinking, of their learning strategies, then that would give me an inroad to students. And it's actually that it's turned out that way, that they typically don't know what it means. And so they're intrigued by the term, and we deconstruct it in presentations. They see exactly what it is, and it gives them a pathway to success that they had not seen before. And it's not just about study skills.
It's sort of like you're piquing their curiosity too, because they haven't heard it. It sounds a bit academic. They are at an institution after all, so it's sort of what they're expecting, versus study skills sounds a little old hat. I've been there, done that, nothing new under the sun.
Exactly. And the other thing that surprised me were students, whenever we say the research says this about learning, it's like they sit up and take notice. And so I think it's a combination of having something they've never heard before, it's research based, and also it just makes sense. When they think about how they've learned other things, if you pretend you're teaching, then that deepens the learning. And I've had students say, oh yeah, I remember in fourth grade when I used to teach my dolls everything, I did really, really well. And so I can help them connect to these are strategies they have used before, not necessarily in an academic setting, but they will work as well in the academic setting as they worked in those other settings.
It's funny because I have a Cabbage Patch Kid that actually went on to get a PhD in English. So just thought I'd throw that out there. So speaking of students, and I know we're going to talk a lot about students today, but how would you characterize the current generation in terms of having the tools to learn effectively? Like, do you see differences or any areas of concern relative to previous generations you've taught?
Oh, very much so. And sometimes when I say that, people say, every generation says that about the previous generation. But I do think that there is a difference now. And I think part of it was brought about with the accountability movement, where now there are these standardized tests that students have to take, that teachers feel pressured really to prepare the students for the test. And so I think the joy of learning and the goal of having students learn has been replaced by the goal of having them score well on these tests. So there's so much drill and kill. Nobody finds that fun, but there's a huge difference post-pandemic. Because during the pandemic, and I think rightly so, there was really a relaxing of what students were required to do. I'll never forget, I was doing a National Science Foundation site visit, and one of the faculty members there, her daughter had called her, and she said that her daughter told her, Mom, we don't even know how to take a test without cheating, because that's just what they did.
Oh my.
And so, yeah, so I think that these students have absolutely no confidence that they can master the material, which is why I think there's so much cheating. But again, these are skills that we can teach students, because to me, it's all about a paradigm shift where they understand what learning is, because they don't have a clue. It's always been just memorizing and regurgitating information. Showing them Bloom's taxonomy so that they see that memorizing is very different from understanding, which is different from applying. And the idea is to be able to get to the point where you can come up with your own theories, your own ideas. You can create, but nobody's ever shown them this before. And I get excited to see how excited they get to know that all of this is there, but nobody ever shared it with them before.
I want to go in so many directions here.
Yeah.
So let me just draw out the equity issue. You
Mhm.
pointed to the digital divide essentially, which is really one form inequity takes, but you have really been trying to champion and solve this metacognitive equity gap. So can you talk about that? What is the metacognitive equity gap?
Okay, yeah, that's a term that I coined back in the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was murdered. And there was so much talk about equity around the country, really around the world. And so I started thinking about the difference between students who do well and who don't, because we talk about achievement gap all the time. That gap has really more to do with the difference in thinking skills that students have acquired up to that point, that I said, well, I'm going to call this metacognitive equity, because that's the real difference in this achievement gap. The students who've gone to better resource schools, who've had access to IB courses, AP courses, they've had access to mentors who can ask them the deep probing questions that require them to do that kind of thinking. Their thinking strategies are very different than students who've only had to memorize information, regurgitate information, have never been given the freedom to create knowledge and information. And so to me, that was where the gap was. And so I just called it a metacognitive equity gap. And I do sessions on that. And I talk about how to close that gap. I'll give you a quick example of that. So many students don't do well on, let's say, papers or projects, because they've never seen what an outstanding project looks like. And so rubrics will help with some of that. But I say showing students examples, and not even telling them, this is a good project, this is a poor project, but give them the rubric and give them three, maybe an outstanding one, a mediocre one, and a poor one, and ask them to use the rubric and evaluate and indicate which is which, because now students are going to see what goes into something that's outstanding. As faculty, what's the first thing we want to see when we're about to write a proposal? We want to see some,
Yeah.
yeah, we want to see
Yeah, yeah.
some proposals that have gotten funded. And so, and then once we see that, we kind of know the direction to go in. But so often we don't give students that information, and we just assume that if they're not succeeding, it's because they can't, as opposed to recognizing that nobody's ever shown them what an outstanding one is and how to get there, and they can do it.
And it helps maybe even not just to see something outstanding, but something that's mediocre or problematic in ways that, from experience, I know students are likely to deliver without that kind of guidance, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just excellence, but also the contrast.
Yeah, so I like to give them the spectrum so that they know what to shoot for. Because if they never see the outstanding one, then they don't know what to shoot for. If they don't see the mediocre one or the very poor one, which is probably what they've been producing in the past, then they don't make that connection that this is where I've been, but this is where I can go.
So you talk a fair bit about growth mindset, and I wonder if you could share a little bit about why that's important for the instructor in terms of their perception of students, and also how do they actually model that for students
Yeah.
as well, so that they can try to overcome that negative self-talk that so many of us deal with.
Yes. Well, let me first say that I am aware that in recent years, there's been a lot of pushback about Carol Dweck's work, and she's addressed some of it. So I don't want people to think that, oh, she doesn't even know that Carol Dweck has been debunked. The basic tenet of what Dweck has found is that most people think that either you have a certain amount of intelligence that you're born with, it's not going to change very much. And she calls that a fixed mindset. And the other view is that you can grow your intelligence with your actions. You can make yourself smarter. And she calls that a growth mindset. And there's actually a research study that looked at the performance of students in the classroom of a professor with a growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And what they found was that all students did better in the classroom of a professor with a growth mindset. And that achievement gap between the Native American, Latino, and African American students, that gap between them and white and Asian students, it was essentially cut in half if they were in the classroom of a
Wow.
professor with a growth mindset. And I think that they didn't talk about why that is, but I think it's because if you have a growth mindset and you know that everybody can improve, that's the message that you communicate to students. And then students will try. I heard some research lately that said, students really want to meet the expectations of that we as faculty have of them. And typically, if you have a fixed mindset, there are a group of students that you don't have high expectations for. And so I think it's so important that faculty recognize the importance of a growth mindset because that's the way we're going to communicate that to students and inspire students to take the steps they need to take in order to reach the potential that they're able to reach. Yeah.
I think particularly in this moment where students have or are thought to have so much apparent power that faculty don't understand how much power they have and how much influence they have in these very subtle ways, like a casual, remark that a student receives as, you're not going to make it is hits deep, right? Because they are so vulnerable to the judgment of faculty in this moment where they're trying to learn and grow and develop and pass to get to whatever's next for them. And so I think the work that is done to help faculty appreciate this and alter their practice is so vital.
I'm so glad you said that, Brad, because the other thing that I'm seeing now is that faculty seem to be held hostage by student evaluations. I've
Mhm.
seen so many faculty who say, well, I can't require that they really learn the stuff because if I do that, then I'm going to get negative evaluations. So to me, that's really sad because I think we can hold these kids to high expectations, but we do have the discussion with them about why we have those high expectations because they won't understand why we're requiring things and they will get angry and upset and mad if they think we're just doing this to them because we can, because we're in a position of power as opposed to we're doing this because we know what's going to make them the best professionals that they can be. Absolutely.
So, so in your work with faculty, the growth mindset is one that you've mentioned. That faculty sometimes come in thinking you either have it or you don't, and that needs some attention and correction. Are there some myths that you have found that you regularly encounter in your work with faculty that you might want to surface in this conversation? Some other things that are contrary to what we know about how people learn that you find widespread belief around that we might characterize as a myth.
I think one thing that a widely held belief is that it's going to take too much time for me to teach students how to do this. But there was a biology professor who she now spends quite a bit of time on this. And I asked her, I said, well, how do you find time to do this? And she said, well, I don't find time to do it. I make time to do it. And she said, because I now realize that it is much more important for us not to just cover information, but to uncover the learning strategies that students need. Because 3 years from now, the information is going to be different, but their ability to process information and learn, that's what's going to benefit them later on.
I spoke with an instructor of psychology who used to devote the first week of class to reviewing the research on effective study habits and then providing examples and guidance to students. So I would have thought like giving them the tools to be successful at the very beginning would be a good idea, at least in principle, but it didn't land. So she decided to introduce this after the first midterm, I think it was, which for a lot of first year students serves as a wake up call, as you said. So I know it did for me. When I had my first midterm. So her students were a lot more responsive. So do you have any guidance on when or how to have
Oh,
these conversations about
yes.
learning strategies with students?
Absolutely. See, the problem with doing it at the beginning, when you talk about these study strategies, the students don't think that you're talking to them. You're talking to all the other dummies in the room who might need this information, but they don't need this information. They came with their A's in their back pocket. What they've always done has always worked. And so they're not attuned to that at all. But it is after that first test where they get the wake up call. I used to give my first test or quiz, 3 or 4 weeks in when I thought I'd had enough stuff to cover to put on there. But now I realize it's got to be much earlier because when students realize that they've not been doing it correctly, they got to start over at the beginning of the course because now they know they haven't learned that information. And the smaller that gap is from the beginning of the semester to when they learn that they've got to do something different, then that makes all the difference in the world.
There's an awful lot of advice out there and a lot of pressure on faculty to evolve their practice. It can be overwhelming. So is there just, one or two strategies that you would recommend prioritizing for educators who really want to evolve their practice and help their students be more successful?
My approach actually is very different than most faculty developers, and I say this all the time. I never tell faculty you need to change your approach. And the reason I don't do that is because I know that most faculty are not interested in changing their approach. So my approach instead is how do I teach faculty what to teach students that students have to do in order to increase their learning? And that goes over much better with faculty because I'm not blaming faculty. I'm not saying, it's your fault. And so if we can give students the strategies to improve their own learning, it doesn't matter whose class they're in or what the professor is doing because now it's in the student's control. But now, having said that, I'm going to answer the question about how can we, what could faculty do to increase student learning? If we give tests earlier and more often so that students are really forced to keep up. And it could even be pop quizzes, unannounced quizzes, where students know that any day that you come in, you might have a quiz. Now, another learning strategy that I have found, and so many students have said, this made the difference for me. I talk about teaching students how to pretend that they're teaching the information. Because if you can teach the information, then you know that you've mastered it. I had this was an engineering professor at the University of North Dakota. And when she learned about this strategy, she said that she started having some of her students co-teach some of the lectures with her. And she found that they put a lot of passion into this work. They brought in a lot more real world examples. And she just saw how they were much more interested in mastering the information when they knew that they were going to co-teach with her. So that's one. And these are strategies that were recommended by Tom Angelo and Pat Cross assessment. But doing this 1 minute paper, what was the muddiest point? What did you not get? What would you want to see covered more? So there are things that we can do. Even the stopping every 15, 20 minutes to do a think, pair, share with students. Throw out a question that they have to discuss so that they become actively involved. Even ask the students, what would make it easier for you to learn information in this class? It was Linda Nilsson who said that what she found was that mid-semester evaluation assessment, where she asked students, what do you like most about what we're doing? What would you like to see changed? And students were so very honest, and they were very surprised that she took their feedback and made changes based on what that feedback was. And I think that's another part of motivation. When students know that we really care about them as individuals, we care about their learning, they will do things that they would not do otherwise.
What about, speaking of Linda Nilsson, questions that you pose to students to get them to think about and reflect on their own learning strategies? Are there any things that you like to ask students? Maybe they've gotten the exam mark back and they're,
Yes.
flummoxed or whatever. Are the things that you like to ask them to get them to think about and reflect on their approach and things that they might actually change for the next round?
Absolutely. Yes. The reflection questions that I love to ask, and most students have never been asked these questions, but one is, what would you say is the difference between studying and learning? And the thing that surprised me about reflection questions, because initially I was so opposed to reflection questions when I first heard about them. I said, I don't have time to throw out these questions, get mamsy-pamsy answers back. I can tell these students what to do much more efficiently. But I went to a conference once and the presenter did this and I saw how everybody was engaged. And so, what's the difference between studying and learning? And typically they'll say things like, studying is just memorizing information for a test or a quiz, whereas learning is when you understand that information, you can apply it, you can relate it to what you already know. One young lady said, well, studying is short term, learning is long term. Studying is what I do to make an A on the test, but learning is what I do if I need to retain that information. And so then they see there's a difference, but nobody's ever gone over this because we've always told them in school, did you study for that test? Because see, the goal is to help students understand what is the difference between what I've done up to this point and what I need to do going forward to get a different result. And unless we ask those questions to help them identify this gap, then they're not going to see it. So that's one. And then the other one is if you knew you had to make an A on the next test, or if you knew you had to teach the material on this next test to the class. And of course, 90% of them say, oh, if I had to teach the material. Well, why would you work hard if you had to teach the material? They'll say, well, I really have to know it if I have to teach it. And faculty laugh at this. It's like, well, didn't they know they had to really know it if they make an A on the test? And the answer is no. And so then I asked them, up to this point in time, would you say you've been more in scenario A mode? You've been preparing to make an A on the next test, or have you been in scenario B mode? You've been preparing to teach the information. And of course, they've all been in scenario A mode. And then I say, I love it, love it, love it. I love it when you're doing everything wrong. Because that means when you start to change things, you're going to see a difference. If you told me you were already doing everything that I'm going to suggest, then, where do we go from there? And the other thing, I never want students to feel bad about anything they've done in the past because they didn't know that they were supposed to do anything different. And I sometimes say that the sessions that I do with students, I'd say maybe it's 50% information, 50% inspiration, motivation, because they have to see that I believe that they can excel. They've got to buy into that passion because that's what's going to fuel the actions that they're going to take after we've talked about the strategies.
It's sort of like tripping over the truth. I mean, people could tell me stuff all day long, but until I realize it for myself, that's when things really start to click.
Exactly. And that's why I tell faculty all the time, we have to connect students with their personal experience. And we can do that with reflection questions.
I do get chills when you talk about this stuff. I mean, it is opening up a reality that is completely unknown to them. I mean, metacognition, the way you get them with these simple questions to think about the act of learning in a way that is unknown to them is revelatory, right? So the students, I mean, that's why there's so much impact here because they are utterly transformed by the recognition that they have an ownership over their development through these mechanisms, through teaching their roommate what they're learning or their goldfish or whatever, that they can actually start to think about different levels of learning with Bloom's taxonomy, right? It just opens up a world to them to really be much more intentional as a learner than they were equipped to be without this kind of information. So what I'm hearing really that faculty can do as simple steps is move toward frequent low stakes assessments, encourage students to teach the material before they come in for an exam. And when they have the opportunity to ask them these kinds of questions to get them to think in these ways.
I'll add one more to that, and that is from day one, communicate the message that I know that everyone in this class can excel. And we're going to work together as a team to make that happen. I'm going to do my part, but I need you to do your part because I know that everyone can excel. And when I was speaking at Henry Ford College a few weeks ago, there was a person who taught economics. And so I also talk about, that first week, giving students an experience that really lets them know that they can excel in the course. And so I asked him what he did. And so he said that he gives his first quiz very early. And typically it's not trivial, but it's not super difficult. So the average typically is about 80. And so then he demonstrates to students. He said, see, we can do this as a class. We got 80 on this. And he said he can just see students' confidence rising. And there's research that shows that the most important determinant of what someone will do is whether or not they think they can be successful if they do it.
I knew we were going to need 3 hours for this conversation. I just find your work so important and so energizing. So it's been a real pleasure having a chance to talk with you again.
Brad, I don't think anybody's ever told me that they got chills based on what I'm saying. So yeah, and you're right. It is transformational for students. And I just get a charge every time I see a student who's come in the office slumped over and they're sitting up, they're walking out. Let's do this.
Love it. Love it. Brad and I both love it.
Yeah, we do.
And I love you.
Yeah, we love you too, Dr. McGuire. This has been so much fun and so insightful. And I love just the note of optimism I think you bring to this conversation. It's a growth mindset, debunked or not, on full display.
Thanks so much. Big fun.
If you want to keep the learning going, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of Dr. McGuire's Teach Students How to Learn, strategies you can incorporate into any course to improve student metacognition, study skills, and motivation. And for all the students out there who might be procrastinating by listening to this podcast, you should definitely check out Teach Yourself How to Learn, strategies you can use to ace any course at any level. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk at you again soon. Higher Listenings is brought to you by Top Hat, the leader in student engagement solutions for higher education. When it comes to curating captivating learning experiences, we could all use a helping hand, right? With Top Hat, you can create dynamic presentations by incorporating polls, quizzes, and discussions to make your time with students more engaging. But it doesn't end there. Design your own interactive readings and assignments and include multimedia, video, knowledge checks, discussion prompts. The sky's the limit. Or simply choose from our catalog of fully customizable Top Hat e-texts and make them your own. The really neat part is how we're putting some AI magic up your sleeve. Top Hat Ace, our AI-powered teaching and learning assistant, makes it easy to create assessment questions with the click of a button, all based on the context of your course content. Plus, Ace gives student learning a boost with personalized AI-powered study support they can access anytime, any place. Learn more at tophat.com/podcast today.